Hello everybody, nice to have you here. So I'm Matthias Naab. Unfortunately, my colleague Jens, who wanted to give the talk together with me, he couldn't make it, so I will make that on myself. So I'm working at Fraunhofer and I'm there the department head for software architecture department. And what I'm talking about today is an ecosystem, and it's an ecosystem for the automotive aftermarket. And so this is a collaboration, so to say, between a company called CARUSO. This is a startup company, and I will talk a bit more about this in a few minutes. And we, as Fraunhofer, are the technological supporter and consulting for them and help them with innovation. But before we go into this ecosystem and before we go into what they are really doing, we just take a step back and look what all this ecosystem stuff is about. And what I brought for you here is a distinction of some terms that get mixed up, at least in Germany and the German-speaking world, because everything there is called somehow digitalization. And in other parts of the world, there might be words like digital innovation and things like that. And it's really hard to separate because we are doing digital things since decades, and now it's called digitalization. And so a few colleagues came up with this separation of terms here. So first, digitization, bringing things, so really products, into a digital world. And then the second step is called here really digitalization, and this is bringing processes into the digital world. And the third step is what we call here then the digital transformation, and this is bringing business models into the digital world. And so this really changes then economy and society. And that's really interesting, and this is also where we are with these ecosystems. And here you see some examples, like for music or for news, where this already happened. And the example where I will talk about, this will be about data from vehicles. So this is a domain where you will be most likely all be confronted with in the future, because I guess every one of you is at least from time to time driving a car, and so let's see what happens with that data. So if we look at these ecosystems, we can observe what that means in terms of what is done there with digital innovation. Yeah, and in general, we have two directions how we can change business with digital support. One is here, which we call incremental innovation, where we just try to make things more efficient. Yeah? This is things that have been happening for last 20, 30 years. But the other way, the y-axis, is about rather radical innovation. Yeah? And they really come up with new business ideas and making things differently. And the digital ecosystems and platform economy, this is something where the most advanced things come together, and where you try to make most out of these digital possibilities and to change things really radically and disruptively. So, and many of these ecosystems are out there actually in many different domains. Maybe you have recognized them partially or not, but this goes from industrial production over farming. So by the way, you saw a lot of these farming slides in the slide roulette this morning. Then we have mobility, we have energy, where we heard a lot about. We have health, and all these domains, they are somehow changed by digital innovation. And the things where I will talk about now, this is most in the area of mobility. But there will be connections also to other domains. We at Fraunhofer came up with a model here for these ecosystems and how to deal with them if you want to build such an ecosystem, or if you want to participate in one. And in the absolute core of such an ecosystem, there you always have to look at three things. It's the technology, it's the business, and it's the legal aspects. And then there are some circles around it, like an onion, where you first look into what happens in your own organization. Yeah, and in your own organization, a lot of changes are needed, from traditional software engineering to creating and building an ecosystem where many other companies should participate. Because an ecosystem is always something that is not completely under your own control, but it's something where you want others and other companies to participate to come up with a greater value by this joint cooperation. And so that means if you want to come up with such an ecosystem, you need ecosystem vision, strategy, how to engineer that, how to operate it. But then you have to look outside. You have to see what are the partners that you want to have in that ecosystem. How do you want to attract them? How do you want to keep them into the ecosystem? And maybe there are further communities around that. And then you have to nurture these communities and you have to settle that up. Because these ecosystems, they strongly live from scale. Yeah? So if an ecosystem stays small, so it will probably not be successful. And most of the time, and this is the observation, there are not many ecosystems in parallel. There is maybe one or two, and all the others die at some point in time. And one good example where you can see that is for the Apple and the Google ecosystems for the mobile phones. Yeah? And there you have these ecosystems for the apps, and they emerged, and some others went from the market. And so the two are the main competitors, and they are there. But now let's jump into our domain, in the domain of connected vehicles. And this is really interesting because we can look here at how the situation changes in terms of vehicles getting connected to the internet, so to say. So they become part of the Internet of Things. And recently, not many vehicles have been connected. But what now happens is that on the one hand, vehicles get connected by retrofit devices. Yeah, these are things like that. So dongles that you can just plug into the OBD2 port. And what also happens, at least in the recent 1, 2, 3 years, is that the vehicles really get connected by the manufacturers, by the vehicle manufacturers. So they get a connection into it, a GSM card, and they can send data to the backends of these manufacturers. And what is really interesting here now is that there is kind of a monopoly for the data with the vehicle manufacturers. Because of course, if the data is sent only to the manufacturer, no one else can directly access it. And the data that is available via this OBD2 port gets probably less than, because the manufacturers want to get the data wirelessly to their backends. And to have a fair competition there is of course interesting for other parties that want to access that data, how they can get it. And this is the interesting question that is behind this ecosystem and behind CARUSO. Because now imagine there are maybe 40, 50 brands for cars, and they all somehow have their data in their backends. And now you are a service provider, maybe an insurance, that wants to access mobility data from these cars, or telematics data. And it's clear that this is pretty hard now for you, because you would need to connect to all these 45 to 50 vehicle manufacturers with their individual APIs. You would have to make individual contracts. You would have to make individual legal things with them, and you would have to agree on business models. And this is, for at least smaller companies, nearly impossible. And this is one of the key motivations why to come up with CARUSO and to found an ecosystem where CARUSO becomes the central data broker for all that data coming from connected vehicles and make them available to service providers that want to provide some service to the drivers of those cars. What is that data about, what I'm talking here? So the most pressing ones is the in-vehicle data, of course. So that is telematics data that originates from the vehicles, and that should be available at some point for a service provider to do something out of it. So this could be the current mileage of the car, this could be defect trouble codes of the car, this could be information about whether the doors are open or closed, and all these other things. I will talk about these data in a bit more detail later. But there's also other information, like information about cars. Yeah, so which spare parts fit into what car? How much time does it consume to repair a car if certain things are broken, to replace a detail? And all these information, centrally managed, provide a great value to the automotive aftermarket and their players to make something out of their data and to provide a better service. Looking at the market evolution, CARUSO is in the very beginning. CARUSO is still quite a small company, but of course they want to grow. There are currently more than 300 million cars in Europe, and of course the goal is to serve as many of them in terms of brokering data. And that means CARUSO has to grow strongly and fast to become one of these, maybe one or two, leading ecosystems that are out there for telematics data. What I will give you now, after each step of advancing through that ecosystem, is always our lessons learned that we came up with when constructing this ecosystem. So I do not want only to show you that ecosystem and its architecture, but to see what we as architects can learn from that. And this is also the things that you can take home if you are ever in the situation to do something like that. So the first thing we learned here is that there are no stakeholders really to ask what the requirements are, because there's not just a single company or a single customer, and there's even no one who can really envision this whole ecosystem with all the partners. So that means you can go to people, you can ask them, but you never get requirements. You get some concerns, you get some wishes, and then you have to come up with a product vision, so to say, or an ecosystem vision what to build. And over time, that means to continuously reinvent and see where you go. You have to adjust it, and it's kind of an experimentation phase. And you build something, you throw it out, you show it to people, and then see what happens. And especially in the very beginning, we are dealing with a very high degree of fuzziness and uncertainty. Of course, that's also in other software systems, we know that, but in this ecosystem area, we see even a higher degree of fuzziness because of all these different partners with their different interests, and some of them really don't know yet whether they want to join the ecosystem, when they want, whether they want to be the first movers or whether they want to go late. And so there's always the question, how can we get them in? What are really the requirements that we should prioritize the highest, and so on. Now let's look at the highest level, so to say, architecture of that ecosystem. And that is, we have in the center here, we have CARUSO with its platform. And this is the product that the CARUSO company also built. But around that, so the overall architecture, there are many other organizations with their systems. Yeah? Here we have the data providers and we have the data consumers. And they get connected via this platform in this sense of platform economy. And of course, there are many, many data providers offering different kinds of data, and there are also a lot of data consumers. And they have to be connected in a business way, in a technical way, and in a legal way. So in a business way means there needs to be somehow standardized business model that has to be supported by the platform to bring provider and consumer together. Legally, there have to be contracts between providers and consumers, and of course also contracts then with the central platform. And technically, of course, all of that has to be made happen because otherwise no data can flow. So a lot of APIs need to be constructed, a marketplace needs to be constructed. We will come to that later. But to make this a bit clearer, I have a very concrete example for you here. How it looks like end-to-end in that ecosystem. And if you look at in Wiggly Data, it always starts with the car. And the car is connected via a data provider, which is here vehicle manufacturer. And on the other hand, you have the driver of that car that wants to consume some service that is based on the data from that car. This could be a tank station, so that the tank station could say, you are near my tank station and your tank is nearly empty. I can make you a special offer. You get a coffee or you get a discount when you drop by and get some gas with my gas station. And now is the question, what happens here? So there's continuously data transported to the vehicle manufacturer, and then the tank station wants to get the mileage data or the tank fill degree for that car. And there can be a request now to the CARUSO platform to access the data. Of course, a lot of setting up is needed before, that is clear, we will come to that later, and a lot of security aspects have to be handled, because this can be only done if the driver has given consent to really access that data. Otherwise, this would be not allowed. And what you see, of course, also is there's not only this one OEM and this one tank station, but there are many, many data providers, and there are many, many data consumers, and here are hopefully millions of drivers of cars, and their cars are on the other side. And all of that has to be brought together, and in addition, we have all these other data, like data about the cars, that can be used to provide even a higher level service. So if we look at that, the pictures look really simple. Yeah, you can see that, and there's just a few boxes. And we found that it's really hard to communicate an ecosystem, because there are so many things involved. There are software systems, there are organizations, there are people with different roles involved. And all of the time we hear, we don't get you with your ecosystem stuff. Make this simpler. We just don't get it. And in particular in a domain that is rather traditional, this is even harder. Some of you might know this analogy from Gregor Hope, where he says, architect is a guy in an elevator who goes hopefully from the technical department to the bosses in a company. Now, if we are in an ecosystem, we have many elevators. We don't only take the elevator in our own company, but we also have to take the elevator in all the partner companies, because we have to convince from the developers in that companies to the bosses to somehow become part of it and how to connect to that ecosystem. Additionally, also the internal stakeholders have to understand the ecosystem very well, because it's not only just the software system they are building, but it's all the stuff around it that is contributed then by other companies. Yeah, if we see that there are these APIs and this marketplace, so you have to understand that this is not only your own system, but the whole ecosystem and how it works comes into life when everything gets connected together, and it gets much more dynamic, as we just heard in the keynote before. The initial partners of this ecosystem are the following ones. So, and you can see that those are from different domains. There are aftermarket players. There is also one OEM, so it's BMW already in. But there's also Bosch, Continental, ZF, Openmatics, Tech Alliance. They are providing data about cars, yeah, like these repair plans, what spare parts fit into a car, and so on. And the yellow ones, as you can imagine, are the data providers, and on this side are the data consumers. But of course, there's a lot of so-called onboarding going on to bring further partners into the ecosystem and to connect them to the ecosystem. So this was the initial stage, and there's a lot of movement, of course, around it. And only if the number of partners strongly grows, the ecosystem can get really successful. Because if you could only access data from BMW, the ecosystem would not be really interesting to the partners. So actually, all the big vehicle manufacturers have to be connected. So if we look at these partners, the selection of the initial partners is absolutely crucial, as you can imagine, because in the beginning, an ecosystem is not really attractive. In the beginning, there is actually no ecosystem. There is just a platform, and this platform is there to create an ecosystem around it, but as long as there are no partners, there is no value in it. And that means you have to find partners that you initially connect to come up with the first value. And of course, they have to match, because if they don't match, so there's no possibility to really make some business, yeah? And then nobody will be interested in that. In the beginning, many of these players in the domain, they will feel this ecosystem idea as an attack to their traditional business. That's very clear. Because you saw this in my slides with these two axes, it's kind of disrupting. Yeah? Maybe certain players have completely different roles if such an ecosystem is really successful. Along this chain of partners, really from the car with its data to the consumer and driver, there are a lot of business models involved. Yeah, there's the business model of the data provider selling data, there's the business model of CARUSO brokering their data, and there's a business model of, in our example, the tank station that also wants to make some business out of that data. And only if these business models are really well aligned, then the whole thing can fly. Yeah, because if it's not attractive for all these parties, they will not join the ecosystem and make it successful together. What is interesting in that is, if you are the initiator of that ecosystem, the others do not really have their business models yet, because there has not been an ecosystem before, no one thought about this, but you as the initiator of the ecosystem, you have to pre-think also about their business models, because otherwise there is just nothing. Yeah? And that means you have to come to a vision, at least roughly, how end-to-end all these business models work and can work together. And what we also found is that this initial onboarding of partners, so really bringing them to the platform, and this is much more than technically connecting them. It's talking about contracts, about their business models. It's talking about what data they want to bring in, what they really want to do with, when they want to really join. And then, as you can imagine, often these are large organizations. This takes a while. And so this is really effort intensive, and at the same time you have to do a lot of these onboardings at the same time, because otherwise you can't grow and you can't be successful. Long term, there is the vision to make this onboarding completely as a self-onboarding. A bit like you're going to Amazon Web Services and you can configure all these services for you automatically, and then at some point in time you are connected. Yeah? So that means how we deal with that strongly changes over time. In beginning, everything is manual and you have to care a lot about to really bring these partners into the ecosystem. And over time, when the ecosystem also gets more mature and when it gets more attractive, then you go to an onboarding that is self-onboarding. Yeah? This is something that you directly have to plan in when you are initiating such an ecosystem, because it can't be differently. Yeah? If we look at platforms, and we often get that question is, are there other platforms and how does that work? And we came up with a platform classification, which you see here. There are not the concrete names actually here. It's just for illustration. But also in this telematics and mobility area, there are a lot of platforms out there that have different purposes. But interestingly, everyone says, we have a platform. And then you say, okay, what does your platform do? And you have to look at it really concretely and deeply to understand what this platform is all about. So the platform term is highly overloaded these days. And there are some platforms that are just for connectivity. Yeah, they are out there. Maybe they give you this OBD2 dongle, you can put it into the car, and then some data gets transmitted, and so you can make some service out of that. Then there are some really domain or market segment solutions, like from insurances. So these are closed systems that are, of course, based on telematics, but maybe you have an insurance and that insurance comes with a dongle, and that dongle is put into the car, and then the insurance can provide driving-based insurance. But this is a closed shop here. And then we have these marketplace things, and there are not so many, actually. But there are probably more than the two that might survive in the long run. And here in the B2B case, CARUSO is one of them. And of course, there's often the question, how is now the connection of all these platforms? And other companies that work with CARUSO here, they have these platforms and they ask themselves, what does that mean for us? Are we now obsolete or can we connect? And the good news is all of them can actually connect, because these connectivity solutions, they can be, of course, connected and become data providers and deliver data to that ecosystem and sell it and even monetize it beyond the original idea and purpose. And also all the other ones that just provide such a market segment solution, they can now extend their reach and their scope, because they can buy data from more cars and more sources and integrate them so they can also connect. And even other companies that provide marketplaces, they can also connect, because there's no reason why data shouldn't be sent over different marketplaces. Yeah, of course, there might be then 2 times a margin on it, but if this is economically feasible, that's actually not a problem. Now we dive into this blue box that was CARUSO. And the highest level architecture that we have here is actually twofold. So this is on the one hand this marketplace, and on the other hand the brokering engine. And what we talked all the time about is there is data flowing from the cars or whatever other sources to some partner systems where it's used to create some service. And this is this lower row here. And here we have this data, yeah, like the mileage of a certain car with a specific VIN is this much, yeah, 10,382 at this point in time. And what is important here to see is this is something that's completely API-based between systems of the partners on the delivering side, CARUSO, and the systems of the partners on the consuming side. And now is, of course, the question, how does all of that get set up? In the very beginning, this is all manual work, so to say. Yeah, this is this effort-intensive onboarding, but later on, there is this marketplace, and an initial version of this marketplace is also already there. And what we have here is, so to say, the metadata that is needed for brokering. And this metadata is who is offering the data, who are our partners, what is the data quality they can provide, how does that actually work in terms of contracts they offer, how much money do they take for it, to which groups of consumers do they actually provide that data. All of that needs to be there, and this is actually then set up by humans. Yeah, there's a human interface where people can go into and put that information into the marketplace, and then the marketplace uses that metadata to steer the actual brokering. And this is the high-level architecture of our platform. And again, to our lessons learned here, as the ecosystem initiator, you have to come up with many, many decisions that affect the whole ecosystem. Yeah? You have to design how the APIs work. You have to design how the partners interact. You have to design how they come up with joint business models and contracts. All of that has to be designed there. Of course, you get into interaction with them and you change it over time while you learn. But in the end, the central resource and platform of that ecosystem has to somehow make that decision. And what is also interesting, if you look at this picture here, it looks really, really simple. Yeah? And actually, it did not all the time before. It looked quite complicated for many months. And then we had, again, to make it simpler and simpler and simpler, because everyone said, we don't understand it, and there is a shareholder meeting, and we have to present it, and we have to go there, and it has to be simple. But it's not so easy to make it simple as it looks like, just by leaving things out. And so we could confirm here again, the more effort you are able to invest and the longer you work on it, the more obvious also the result gets. Yeah, if you look at that now, you say, yeah, it couldn't be different. Or, after all what I told you, you would say, yeah, I could have drawn this directly. There's no problem. It's just that simple. And this is really interesting because it makes you feel a little bit bad about that. You think you're an experienced architect and you have done a lot of stuff before, and now you make something like that and you draw such a picture and it becomes simpler and simpler, and then you say, how could that be? But it is like that, and maybe you also have the same experience from time to time. So, So here we have a classification of the data on CARUSO May, and this is again split into this marketplace and a brokering runtime. And the one that you see here in this darker blue, this is the actual data that we care about when we broker it and sell it. But all these other data, like the data catalog and specifying the offers and so on, this all has to be designed, and this is a huge challenge to come up with all these data models. And data is often not too much in the focus of architects. At least it has not been in the past, but also Owen has told us this morning that this comes more and more. It's not only about these component boxes and the connections between them, it's a lot about data, and the same is what we are finding here too. And here in the runtime, it's a lot about logging, about billing information, exactly this business monitoring data that he told, where you come up with dashboards so that everyone can understand what's going on in your ecosystem. And this is a bit more into the details. I do not want to bother you with that too much. It's an architecture that is based on microservices. Of course, in the long run, we have to hopefully scale a lot. Yeah, that's clear. We did not over-design it in the beginning, but we made some decisions to make it scalable already early when scaling is not too much needed. Yeah, but I will not explain that in all the details. But to really have that scale, also from an infrastructure perspective, the scaling possibility, the platform sits on AWS. And this is, of course, a very proven platform that also many other companies use and that is worldwide available. While CARUSO is starting in Europe, it also has plans to go to other regions like the US, like to China, and there it's, of course, also important to have a platform that supports something like that. As you can imagine, security is an absolute key feature for something like CARUSO, where you're dealing only with data actually, and in particular in Europe. So maybe some of the people from the US might not be too much involved into that. You have this GDPR, this General Data Privacy Regulations, and this is pretty hard to fulfill because it just comes in 2 weeks from now, where it gets really, really active, and you have to care a lot about the consent and of the user and the lawfulness of data processing. And along this whole chain of data transfer and processing from the car to the actual service of the driver, a lot has to be done about security. And of course, I can't tell all of the things now here in that short time, but we are caring there about a lot of things, and of course, not everything is done yet. Yeah, this is just growing as everything else grows too. Here I have a quick look for you at this marketplace UI. I told you about this marketplace where the people can go to. And what we have here is 2 different views. So this is the marketplace where you can really go in and see what kind of data can I buy from that, and for what vehicles can I get this data. And on the other hand, this is here the dashboard, where we can see how much data did I consume, how much money did I pay for it, or how much money did I earn from selling data via CARUSO. This is the data catalog, so in vehicle data. So you can see there are a lot of categories that cover everything in data that you can get from a car. No worries, I will not read through everything of that. It's just to give you an idea, and the number here always means how many data items, concrete ones, are behind this category. And in total, it's between 400 and 500 at the moment. But this is, of course, not fixed. This is continuously growing work from all the sources where we see that data is interesting and requested. We incorporate it continuously into this data catalog here. We also made a study on that, so Fraunhofer and CARUSO, and this study is called Wiggly Data. It will be out soon, also to be purchased. And what we have in this study is the request from several companies of the automotive aftermarket, what kind of data they need, what is most important for them, how they rank the importance, and also at which quality and frequency they want to consume that data. And what is also in is the full current data catalog of CARUSO. So you can find all these 400 whatever data items in it here along all these categories that you have seen. So what we can learn from that now, from our real architecture work here of the platform is, we have a continuous tension. And this tension is between building the platform itself and onboarding partners. And both is really effort consuming, and you have to do it at the same time, but it's somehow working against each other. Yeah? You want to serve the new partners and to connect them as fast as possible. And at the same time, you want to grow your platform and come up with new features and make it better, more quality, whatever. And this is hard to achieve and to balance, because this is a continuous business trade-off. What you also need to do is you need to demonstrate a lot. Yeah, you can imagine you go to a lot of companies and they are not used to such an ecosystem. They have no concrete idea what they could do with it and how it would look like. And this made us build a prototype and a demonstration that we can take everywhere. And this is an interesting mix of real-world partner systems and a demo part, because not everything is already available in the envisioned status from real partners. And so these parts are mocked then. And there was also a Go Live event in November where we first brought this to public. And we can highly recommend to come up with such demonstrations that make it as tangible as possible to see that ecosystem. And having these prototypes as early as possible, you can imagine that this is also in these ecosystems and platform business a very good idea. Of course, at some point in time, you have to switch to product mode, which means production quality and all of that. And this increases a lot the engineering effort. And it's the question, when do you really want to make that? Some words about the business model here, how that works. So end-to-end, the data provider defines the price for the data. Yeah? So that means whether a certain data item has a certain cost, and what this is always designed by the data provider, according to some business models that are enabled by CARUSO. And then CARUSO gets a margin from that, and the data consumer has to pay that price. And of course, many different business models are imaginable that data providers can have. So from data flat rates via paying for single data items to many other things that are imaginable. If we now come back to this ecosystem slide here and think about ecosystem architecture as a whole, I also would like to share some experiences with you here. So this ecosystem architecture is much more than just a platform architecture that you have under control as the initiator of an ecosystem. Yeah? You have to see the overall landscape of partners and of their systems that want to connect and integrate with that ecosystem. And partially you know them, partially you don't know them, you have to make assumptions, but you have to be prepared to connect many, many of those partners, because such an ecosystem can be only successful at scale. And this is what you have to look here at. Then I already talked about these aligned business models and the relationships in terms of our architecture. In the big picture here are very many. You have, of course, flow of data, you have flow of control, but you also have flow of money. That is on your arrows in your architecture. You have legal relationships, so we have architecture diagrams, so to say. What are the contracts that are made between which companies? And this has to be understood because in the end, in the architecture, you bring all the technological, the business, and the legal aspects together. And the platform that you are designing is always the central and connecting element here. And to achieve quality, and this is of course a high desire, you have to look end-to-end through the whole ecosystem. From what happens in the car to what happens in the app of the end user, all the things you have to somehow take into account, although you do not have full control over it, but nevertheless you have to look at it and think how you can also influence your partners in the ecosystem around the platform to make this quality happen. So this end-to-end thinking is very, very important here. What we can also share is there are many ecosystems already out there, however you call them and define them exactly. So there's a lot of discussion ongoing, but you can see ecosystems like and platforms like in the Uber case and in the Amazon Marketplace case, and you can also look at older things like eBay and all the other things, and you can get ideas from that, and you can think what you can take from that. But your ecosystem, in case you are initiating one, is of course probably also different, and you have to watch very carefully what is transferable, because the domain is different, the way how the business connects is different, and what you see here is with this, we have a car that connects, and there's a broker, and then there's a service provider, and in the end there is a customer. This is something that might be repeating somewhere, but is also very different to many of the other ecosystems we know already. So there's the continuous challenge to see what we can learn from and what we have to make different to make it successful in our own case. That's actually it. I thank you very much. I'm open now for discussion, so my moderator will take that from me.
So, yeah, I have a question. We have talked a little bit about how your stakeholders have to understand the ecosystem and how it works.
Yeah.
And when I think of the platforms that are already up and successful, like the major app stores, AWS Marketplace, I don't have to really understand it to get going. I upload my stuff, I get online, I read what I have to do, and I put in my bank account what I should transfer the money to. And do you really think it's necessary for your environment that the customers really understand this whole complex thing? Or is it just a thing that you need in the startup phase with your startup partners?
I think it might change over time. That's an interesting observation. And the question is also who you see as a customer. If I really look at the end customer, so the drivers, I'm convinced, as you said, that they do not have to fully understand it, because they are in the same position. They get the app from the tank station, for example, or from their insurance, whatever, and they connect it, and then they are done. But for these B2B partners, it's a bit different, in particular in the beginning, because it changes their business. And this is something they can't envision completely on their own, but this is something that has to be supported. Because CARUSO has, of course, the ambition to make this happen, and to make this happen and to make it jointly happen and to grow it, of course, you have to support the others to understand it as fast as possible to grow. And there is no chance than working intensively with them in the beginning. But I also agree with what you said later. This might change over time, because as more the ecosystem gets established, there are many examples out there how these things work. And of course, not all business will be different by these partners. So if the first 3 workshops are maybe connected, the 4th to 10 ones, they see exactly how that works, and then they go to the self-onboarding platform and they can just do it. And in that sense, I think you're right there.
I think that's it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.